Chapter 21 of Napoleon I, An Intimate Biography, by Walter Geer. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. 21. 1815. Waterloo. The reasons for Napoleon's decision to return from Elba were partly personal and partly political. The personal reasons, which have already been alluded to, were the refusal of the Emperor of Austria to allow his wife and son to rejoin him, the failure of the French government to pay his allowance, and the talk at Vienna of removing him to the Azores or St. Helena. There were also numerous political reasons. The Bourbons, who had "learned nothing and forgotten nothing" during their long exile, were extremely unpopular in France. The king dated his first document from "the 19th year of my reign," as if there had never been a republic and an empire. He restored the white flag, and banished the glorious tricolor, which had been borne in triumph to every capital in Europe. He dissolved the Old Guard, and formed the Maison du Roi, a corps of 6,000 royalists. The peasants, by far the most numerous class in France, were alarmed at the demands of the nobles and the clergy for the restoration of their lands, which had been confiscated and sold to the people. Moreover, the powers at the Congress of Vienna were quarreling over the division of the spoils, and the former allies seemed on the brink of war. On Saturday, the 25th of February, 1815, at Porto Ferraio, the only subject of conversation was the ball to be given by the Princess Pauline. The Emperor was present that evening, and was full of life. When he left at a late hour, he called Bertrand and Drouot to his room, and informed them of his intention to sail the next night. On Sunday, at 5 o'clock, the little army of 1,100 men received the order to embark on the 6 small vessels which composed the fleet. As had happened so many times before in his career, wind and wave were favorable to Napoleon, and the south wind which bore him to France kept Campbell, the English commissioner, becalmed in the harbor of Livorno. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Napoleon sailed into the Gulf Juan, and landed near Cannes. Around the headland to the left was Fréjus, where he had been welcomed home from Egypt, and whence he had sailed for Elba. A little farther to the west was Toulon, where his name first became known, and whence he sailed for the Orient. Beyond the Cape to the east was Nice, where he took command of the army of Italy. The whole littoral for him was full of memories. To-day, on the avenue from Cannes to Nice, the tourist sees in the shade of a tree by the roadside a simple shaft of stone bearing only the inscription, "Souvenir du 1er Mars, 1815." This marks the spot where Napoleon landed. Turning away from the royalist towns of the coast of Provence, the Emperor at once marched north into the mountains. His first objective was Grenoble, a district which he believed would be favorable to him. Just before reaching this place, on the 7th of March, there occurred a scene without parallel in the history of the world. In the defile of La Fraye there is a narrow road between lake and hills. Here he found a battalion of infantry drawn up in order of battle, commanded by de Lessart. This officer, who was only 19 years of age, was a nephew of General Marchand, the commander of Grenoble. Although he was then very bitter against Napoleon, under the Second Empire he became Marshal of France and Minister of War. Napoleon, who had ridden up with his lancers, now dismounted. He ordered his soldiers to carry their muskets reversed under their left arms, and at their head advanced towards the battalion. He wore his well known hat with the little cockade, and the traditional gray redingot. "There he is! Fire!" cried Captain Randon. The soldiers were livid, their knees shook, and their hands trembled. When he was within a few paces, Napoleon opened his overcoat and said, "If there is amongst you a soldier who would slay his Emperor, here I am." A great shout arose of "Vive l'Empereur!" The soldiers tore off their white cockades, broke ranks, and rushed to surround their beloved commander. Randon set spurs to his horse and rode away, while de Lessart burst into tears and surrendered his sword to the Emperor, who comforted him. Before leaving Elba, Napoleon had said, "I shall arrive in Paris without firing a shot," and in his proclamation to the army he had written, "The eagle will fly from steeple to steeple, even to the towers of Notre Dame." Both of these predictions were verified. From Grenoble to Paris, Napoleon's journey was one long ovation. At Lyons a large force under MacDonald melted away at his approach. Ney, who had promised the King that he would bring Bonaparte back in an iron cage, was deserted by his own soldiers, who left him with the cries of "Vive l'Empereur!" Unable to resist the general contagion, he too went to offer his sword to Napoleon, who received him with open arms. The monarchy fell to pieces like a house of cards. The troops sent to stop Napoleon's march joined his army. A placard was attached to the Vendôme column: "Napoleon to Louis XVIII. My good brother, it is useless to send any more troops. I have enough." Napoleon accomplished the last stage of his journey from Fontainebleau to Paris in a carriage escorted by only half a dozen Polish lancers. A little before midnight on Palm Sunday, the 19th of March, the King left the Tuileries, and before noon the following day the tricolor was flying over the palace and all the public buildings in Paris. The funds which, on the news of Napoleon's landing, had fallen 10 points, had already recovered half their loss. On Monday evening, Hortense, several of the marshals, and many of the former ministers and dignitaries of the Empire, were waiting at the Tuileries for the arrival of the master. There was a thick fog and a sprinkle of rain, but the expectant crowd could see the lights in the windows. About 9 o'clock a distant sound of horses was heard. A post chaise entered the courtyard at a trot, followed by 1,000 horsemen, crying, "Vive l'Empereur!" They were troops who had been sent out the evening before to fight him. Napoleon was lifted from the carriage and borne up the grand staircase in the arms of his Old Guard. At length he reached his cabinet, and the doors were closed against the crowd. Such was the return from Elba, one of the most marvellous episodes in history. It was resolved upon and arranged by Napoleon alone, and surprised the Bonapartes as much as it did the Bourbons. It was a movement of the people assisted by the army. Peasant and soldier marched side by side. It was a great tribute to the popularity of the Emperor, and the most impressive form of plébiscite. Landing on the coast of France with 1,100 men, Napoleon had marched in triumph to the capital, and entered the Tuileries to find his court around him and the palace decorated and illuminated for his reception. If supreme power is ever to be founded on the basis of a nation's will, no sovereign in history ever had a clearer title to his throne than the right of Napoleon to reign over France. The Emperor was able to nominate his ministers on the very night of his arrival. Marat became Secretary of State, and Cambacérès Minister of Justice, while Gaudin took charge of the finances. It is remarkable that all three were members of the consular government after the 18 Brumaire. Davout consented, with some reluctance, to be Minister of War. Caulaincourt again took the portfolio of Foreign Affairs. Savary refused the post of head of the police, and Napoleon reluctantly appointed that notorious turncoat, Fouché. The veteran Carnot, the organizer of victory, was made Minister of the Interior. It was a strong ministry made up of men of talent and experience. But Napoleon's fate was to be decided at Vienna, and not at Paris. When the news of his return was received there, a declaration was drawn up and signed placing Napoleon under the ban of Europe as a public enemy. The rigor of this decree has been generally condemned, and the English historians try in vain to defend it. There were a few civil disturbances in the Vendée and the South, but the imperial government was immediately recognized almost everywhere. Although Napoleon at once made overtures of peace, his arrival at the Tuileries was regarded by the other powers as a declaration of war. His circular address to the sovereigns was stopped at the frontiers. The members of the Bonaparte family who were outside the limits of France were interned. But if these were the sentiments of the rulers, the feeling of the peoples was very different. In Italy, in Belgium, and along the Rhine, the return of Napoleon was hailed with joy. But the general voice of Germany called out for an invasion of France. In England, public opinion was divided. The government was in favor of war, while the Whigs made a popular hero of Napoleon. At Paris, Napoleon, in order to reassure the people, did his best to conceal the hostile designs of the powers, and the city remained quite calm. At the same time he reviewed every day in the Carrousel the soldiers who were leaving for the frontier. He also showed himself constantly to the people, riding about the streets almost alone. A very interesting account of Napoleon at this time is given in the letters of John Cam Hobhouse to Lord Byron. In the court of the Carrousel he stood within 10 paces of the Emperor at a review. Napoleon fixed his eyes and filled his imagination. He also saw him at the Français, at his first visit to the theatre after his return, and says that it is impossible to give any idea of the joy with which Napoleon was received. Napoleon entered at the 3rd scene. The whole mass rose with a shout which still thunders in my ears. I saw the Bourbon princes received for the first time in the same place last year. Their greeting will bear no comparison with that of Napoleon, nor will any of those accorded to the heroes of the very many ceremonies I have witnessed in the course of my life." Hobhouse concludes with this remark: "There is something magical in that power of personal attachment which is proved by 1,000 notorious facts to belong to this extraordinary man; and never had any one who wore a crown so many friends or retained them so long." On the 1st of June took place the famous assembly of the Champ de Mai, when the Emperor presented the eagles to the 50,000 soldiers who filed before him. Hobhouse, who was present, says that the scene was more magnificent than any pen can describe. When Napoleon entered the Tuileries on the 20th of March, he was elated at his triumph and full of energy, resolution, and hope. But in a few weeks the outlook changed decidedly for the worse. The Powers placed him under the ban of Europe, and armed 1,000,000 men to overthrow him. The situation in France was most discouraging. The army was in want of men, the arsenals of supplies, the treasury of funds. Everywhere he found hostility and suspicion. Even Napoleon's iron constitution could not stand the strain of this mental torture on top of almost continual labor to bring order out of chaos. When he left Paris to place himself at the head of the army he was no longer the same man, morally or physically. For the first time he was subject to bodily ailments of a very painful nature. He had lost hope and energy, and was no longer confident of success. In order to restore confidence at home and conquer peace abroad, Napoleon realized as never before that he must gain a great victory. He had decided to leave for the front on the 12th of June. The evening of the 11th he dined with his mother, his brothers, and the princesses at the Élysée, where he had moved from the Tuileries in April. After dinner the 2 children of Hortense were brought to him, and little Louis begged him not to go to war. Napoleon turned to Marshal Soult after the boy had gone, and made the prophetic remark, "He is perhaps the hope of my race." Before entering on the description of his last campaign, it is necessary to consider the condition of the forces with which Napoleon hoped to secure the victory. By the 1st of June he had 200,000 men in the field. The National Guard numbered the same, and 50,000 more were detached in depot. Coming now to the personnel of the army, Napoleon's old chief of staff, Berthier, who had served him in this capacity for 20 years, had retired to Bavaria, and his loss was badly felt during the campaign. To supply his place, the Emperor selected Marshal Soult, a very bad choice. Soult had great qualities, but was not fitted by temperament or experience for this position, where others would have done better. Napoleon was obliged to leave Davout behind at Paris, because there was no one else to whom he could entrust the care of the capital. Augereau had been struck from the list, and Marmont and Victor had followed the King. Macdonald refused to serve, and Oudinot and St. Cyr were not employed. Masséna and Mortier were ill. Brune was sent to the south, and Jourdan and Suchet were also employed. Ney was summoned at the last moment and given an important command, but it would have been better if Napoleon had left him at Paris. Grouchy, who had just received his bâton, had a great reputation as a cavalry officer, and Napoleon could not know how fatal his services were to prove. On the 1st of June, a large Austrian army under Schwarzenberg was nearing the Rhine, and Russia was also making great military preparations. Across the frontier in Belgium, an Anglo-Prussian army was assembled near Brussels. Napoleon considered 2 plans of operations. He could either await the enemy's attack, which would give him more time to organize and equip his army, and a better chance of success, or advance to the attack himself and endeavor to crush a part of the allied forces before the rest could come up. For many reasons he chose the latter course. Of his 200,000 men, he kept 120,000 in hand as his main army, and sent the remainder to the Vendée, Italy, the Rhine, and the Pyrenees. The military situation at the opening of the campaign was favorable to Napoleon. The allied army was spread out on a line of over 80 miles along the Belgian frontier. They needed 2 entire days to assemble on the same battlefield. Wellington's headquarters were at Brussels, Blucher's at Namur. The English line of communications ran through Brussels to Antwerp, the Prussian through Liège to Cologne. In case of disaster the lines of retreat would diverge. It is interesting to note that in his last campaign Napoleon was confronted by exactly the same problem as in his first, and that he solved it in the same way. Now, as in 1796, his opponents were superior in numbers, occupied an extended front, and had divergent lines of communications. He decided as before to strike in full force at the point of junction, drive a wedge between the two armies, and throw them back on their respective bases. The plan was a Napoleonic masterpiece, but its execution was far from perfect. Nevertheless, it almost succeeded, and was lost but by a few hours' delay. The theatre of the 1815 campaign is bounded on the south by the Sambre from Maubeuge to Namur. About midway between these two places lies Charleroi, where one of the main roads to Brussels crosses the river. 10 miles to the north, this chaussee is cut by the paved road which runs from Halle through Nivelles to Namur, and this crossroads is known as Quatre Bras. Ligny lies a mile south of this road, northeast of Charleroi. About 20 miles to the north of Charleroi is the little village of Waterloo, a short 10 miles to the east of which is Wavre. The ground is rolling and mostly open, with country roads running in every direction, and no streams of any importance. All of the operations of the campaign were conducted within the irregular triangle whose apex is Brussels, and the base a line drawn from Mons through Charleroi to Namur. In the early hours of the 15th of June, the French army crossed the Sambre at Charleroi without opposition, and took Wellington and Blucher completely by surprise. The first definite information they received was from Bourmont, the commander of the vanguard of the French right column, who went over to the enemy and betrayed the Emperor's plans. During the day the French left wing under Ney pushed back the enemy's outposts towards Quatre Bras, but failed to reach that point. One corps, under Vandamme, encamped near Fleurus, just south of Ligny, while the Guard and the corps of Gérard and Lobau were near Charleroi. At the same time Blucher took up a battle position near Ligny, and Wellington hurried up reinforcements to his troops at Quatre Bras. These arrangements led to the 2 battles of the 16th. In the battle of Ligny, fought on the 16th of June, Blucher had about 80,000 men against the 70,000 of Napoleon. When the Emperor found the Prussians were in force at Ligny, he sent orders to Ney, and also direct to Erlon, for the First Corps to support his frontal attack upon Ligny. But when Erlon did not appear, he finally sent in the Guard, who drove the Prussians from their position. At the same time, Ney had attacked the English at Quatre Bras with Raille's corps. Owing to the contradictory orders received by Erlon from Napoleon and Ney, his corps spent the afternoon in marching and countermarching between the 2 battlefields, and took no part in the fighting at either place. Consequently, Ney was repulsed at Quatre Bras, and Napoleon's victory at Ligny was not decisive. The battle did not end until 10 o'clock, and no pursuit was attempted that night. All that Ney had accomplished was to contain Wellington. The whole operation, save for the fatal loss of time, had been well carried out, and Napoleon felt satisfied with the opening act of the campaign. He had broken through the Allied centre, and had beaten Blucher singly. The immediate thing for him to do was vigorously to pursue the routed Prussians, and prevent them from rallying and uniting with the English. This Napoleon failed to do. He returned to his quarters at 11 o'clock in such a state of fatigue that he was incapable of action. On the previous day he had been on horseback for nearly 18 hours directing the movements of his troops, and during the battle of Ligny he had again spent many hours in the saddle through a day of terrible heat. Much has been written regarding the condition of Napoleon's health during this campaign, but the evidence seems to show that he was in his usual health, although he may have suffered from a local ailment which rendered horseback riding painful and fatiguing. The 17th, Napoleon was very late in rising, and no orders were issued until 8 o'clock. He then gave Grouchy command of the corps of Vandamme and Gérard, over 30,000 men, and sent him in pursuit of Blucher. The Emperor naturally supposed that the Prussians had retreated to the northeast towards Liège. Instead of that, Blucher had abandoned his line of communications and was retiring on Wavre. For many years after the battle of Waterloo, a wholly false notion was prevalent as to the task assigned by Napoleon to Grouchy. The Marshal denied over and over again that he had received any written order from the Emperor to supplement the verbal instructions referred to above. It was not until 1842 that the Bertrand Dispatch was published, in which Napoleon says that it is important to penetrate whether the Prussians "are separating themselves from the English, or whether they are intending still to unite to cover Brussels or Liège in trying the fate of another battle." This order clearly shows that Napoleon distinctly recognized the possibility of the Prussians uniting with the English, and that, in this case, he expected Grouchy to act in conjunction with the main army. That Grouchy, in spite of his many denials, fully understood his task is shown by his dispatch of the 17th of June at 10 p.m., in which he says that if the Prussians retire on Wavre, he will follow them in that direction, in order that they may not be able to gain Brussels, and to separate them from Wellington. After giving these orders to Grouchy, Napoleon with the remainder of his army marched to Quatre Bras to join Ney. On reaching there at 1 o'clock, he found that Wellington had gone. He immediately followed, and on his arrival at La Belle Alliance the same evening, he found the English army drawn up at Mont Saint Jean, evidently resolved to give battle. South of Brussels, for many miles, stretches the large forest of Soignes. At a distance of 3 leagues from the capital, on the edge of the woods, lies the little village of Waterloo, the headquarters of Wellington, which gave its name to the battle. 2 miles farther on is Mont Saint Jean, where the battle was fought. A glance at the map will show that the salient points of the battlefield of Waterloo form an almost perfect letter A. The top of the letter, where the 2 highroads from Nivelles and Charleroi to Brussels join, is Mont Saint Jean. There is Wellington. The lower right point is La Belle Alliance. There is Napoleon. The lower left point is Hougoumont, an old stone chateau which lay in a large grove, and with its enclosing walls stood like a kind of fortress just in front of the French lines. The cord or cross piece of the A is a by road which intersects the 2 highroads at right angles, and, like many of the Belgian roads, in places is sunk much below the level of the fields. This road, which borders the crest of the plateau of Mont Saint Jean, and cuts the Brussels route at right angles, covered almost the entire English position with a line of natural obstacles. To the east of the highway the road was on a level with the fields, but a double border of high and thick hedges rendered it impassable by cavalry. To the west the road was sunk from 5 to 10 feet between 2 banks, and thus formed for a distance of over 400 yards a formidable entrenchment. By many historians the existence of this sunken road is entirely ignored, while others seem to doubt that there was such an obstacle. This is perhaps due to the fact that this part of the field was much changed a few years after the battle in the construction of the immense Mound of the Belgian Lion. At that time the hedges were cut down and the sunken road was obliterated. That these 2 features existed at the time of the battle, however, is clearly shown in the official engineer's map drawn up in 1816. This road must not be forgotten, as it played a very important part in the battle. Just below the point where the cord joins the right down stroke of the A is La Haie Sainte, whose buildings and walls were fortified and held, like those of Hougoumont, by the English. The triangle comprised between the point, the 2 down strokes, and the cord of the A, is the plateau of Mont Saint Jean, the centre of the British line. This plateau in a way dominates the surrounding country, and on its southern slopes was drawn up Wellington's army, numbering about 70,000 men. In its front, along a lower crest less than a mile away, was the army of Napoleon, which was about the same size. Between the plateau on which the 2 armies were posted, the ground is much lower, so that the French had to march uphill to attack. Opposite La Haie Sainte, nearer the other downstroke of the A, now rises the Mound of the Belgian Lion. The mound is 200 feet in height, and is surmounted by a huge lion cast from the metal of French cannon captured in the battle. In order to build this large mound, many thousand wagon loads of earth were taken from the plateau, and this has much changed the contour of the country, so that at the present time it is not easy to recognize many of the salient points. In the banqueting hall of the old palace of Whitehall in London, now occupied by the Royal United Service Museum, there is a large model of the battle which gives a better idea of the disposition and movements of the forces on the eventful day than an actual visit to the field. Although naturally strong for defensive purposes, the British position was subject to the defect of having its line of retreat along a single narrow road through a dense forest, and in case of defeat the English army would have been practically annihilated. At Waterloo, as in Russia, the Emperor owed his defeat largely to the elements. It was always his habit to begin his battles at daybreak. On the 18th of June, almost the longest day in the year, the sun in this northern latitude rose about 4 o'clock, and the battle, if commenced at dawn, in all probability would have been over and the English army destroyed before noon. But it had rained in torrents the previous night, and the ground was too soft for artillery manoeuvres. Napoleon, who had a large superiority in guns, and who had never forgotten that he was once an officer of artillery, therefore waited until nearly noon for the ground to dry and harden before giving the signal for attack. Although the English made a brave resistance, at 4 o'clock the battle was decidedly going against them. Wellington frequently looked at his watch and "wished to God that night or Blucher would come." At this crisis of the battle, when a decisive French victory seemed certain, the Prussians began to arrive on the field, and the Emperor had to send a part of his reserves to hold them in check. The English army had already begun to fall back, and troops were no longer to be seen on the front of the opposite plateau. Napoleon now decided to make a supreme effort to break the English centre by a charge of the cavalry of the Old Guard. Before giving the order, he once more carefully surveyed the field with his glass. His trained eye noticed a dark line running parallel to the enemy's front, and only a few hundred feet before it. He leaned over in his saddle and asked a question of the Belgian guide who stood beside his horse. The answer was negative. The Emperor then sent an aide de camp to give the order to charge. Ney drew his sword and put himself at the head of the guard. No such sight had been seen since the taking of the great redoubt by the heavy cavalry at Borodino. This magnificent body of horsemen, 6,500 in number, descended the hill at a trot, disappeared in the battle smoke, and then reappeared at the other side of the valley, mounting the hill at full gallop. It seemed as if nothing could resist the impact of this solid mass of men. Suddenly, at the right of the line, the front rank tried to pull rein. Arrived almost at the top of the hill, the cuirassiers for the first time perceived between them and the English a deep moat. It was the sunken road. It was a terrible moment, an unlooked for catastrophe. The first line attempted to pull up, but the second line pushed the first, and the third shoved the second. There was no way of holding back. The impetus acquired to annihilate the English crushed the French. When this ditch was full of living men and horses, the rear squadrons passed over their bodies. Nearly a third of one brigade perished in this hole. The negative reply of a treacherous guide to the Emperor's inquiry had brought about this fatality, which perhaps decided the fate of Napoleon. Although the full force of the charge had been broken, the plateau was taken by the French, but they were unable to maintain themselves there, and were finally forced to retire. There is little doubt that this charge, but for the catastrophe of the sunken road, would have broken the British centre and decided the battle. Wellington, who was so nearly defeated, could not repress an exclamation of admiration. He said, "Splendid!" When finally exhausted, the French cavalry turned and drifted down the slope, it was followed by the entire English army. The French were becoming demoralized, and Napoleon was obliged to put in his last reserve, the infantry of the Old Guard. The sky had been covered all day. All at once, at this very moment, about 8 o'clock in the evening, the clouds parted in the west, and there appeared the large red ball of the setting sun. It was the rising sun which had greeted Napoleon on the field of Austerlitz. For this last effort, every battalion of the Guard was commanded by a general. When the tall bearskin caps of the grenadiers appeared amidst the gloom of the falling night, the enemy for a moment recoiled at the sight of these veterans of so many wars of the Empire, who never yet had advanced except to victory. Knowing that they were going to die, they still saluted Napoleon as of old, with cries of "Vive l'Empereur!" Although the guard heard the cries of "Sauve qui peut," and saw their fellow soldiers retiring all around them, they continued to advance. They were led by Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave. After having 5 horses shot under him, he advanced on foot, a broken sword in his hand, crying to the English, "Venez voir comment meurt un Maréchal de France sur le champ de bataille." But in vain. He bore a charmed life. He was to meet his fate from French bullets. Night had now come, and only a few squares of the guard remained. Abandoned by all, terrible in their expiring agony, they still fought on. Austerlitz, Jena, Friedland, Wagram, were dying in them. At 9 o'clock only one square was left at the foot of the plateau of St. Jean. The English, filled with admiration for so much heroism, suspended their fire, and an officer cried, "Brave Frenchmen, surrender!" Cambronne gave the immortal reply, "La garde meurt et ne se rend pas." Says Victor Hugo, "The man who gained the battle of Waterloo was not Napoleon, who was routed. It was not Wellington, giving way at 4, hopeless at 5. It was not Blucher, who took no part in the battle. The man who gained the battle of Waterloo was Cambronne." At the reply of Cambronne, the English officer cried, "Fire!" When the smoke rolled away, nothing was left. Like the fortunes of Napoleon, the Old Guard had passed away upon the bloody field of Waterloo. As the Old Guard went in, Napoleon had started to descend into the valley to share their fate, but 2 faithful aides de camp seized the reins of his bridle and led him like a man in a dream from the field. What was the cause of the downfall of Napoleon? The question has been asked 1,000,000 times, and answered in many different ways. The treason of Bourmont, the incapacity of Grouchy, and the rashness of Ney undoubtedly had much to do with the failure of the campaign. Too much stress has been laid by some historians on the failing health of the Emperor, and the decline in his mental powers, of which there is little evidence. Says Victor Hugo in his splendid sketch of the battle of Waterloo, in the 2nd volume of Les Misérables, "Was it possible for Napoleon to win the battle? We answer in the negative. Why? On account of Wellington? On account of Blucher? No, on account of God. Bonaparte, victor at Waterloo, would not harmonize with the law of the 19th century." Says John Holland Rose at the conclusion of his brilliant Lowell lectures on the "Personality of Napoleon": "In a world which his energies had awakened to full consciousness, such a career could not achieve lasting success. Providence uses such men while they serve its mysterious designs for the uplifting of the race. It casts them aside when their renovating work is accomplished. Napoleon saw not when that time had come. He struggled on towards the Indies, Cadiz, and Moscow as though the new age of nationality had not dawned, and therefore he ended his days at St. Helena." Says Maréchal Foch in an essay published on the 100th anniversary of the death of Napoleon, "In my opinion, the deep reason for the disaster which overwhelmed him was that he forgot that a man cannot be God; that above the individual there is the nation; that above men there is the moral law; and that war is not the highest goal, since above war there is peace." Napoleon reached Charleroi at 5 o'clock on the morning after the battle. Leaving orders for the army to rendezvous at Laon, he immediately proceeded to Paris, where he arrived early on the 21st, and went to the Élysée. He was completely worn out with fatigue. His brother Lucien advised him to seize the reins of power by a coup d'état, but Napoleon was no longer equal to such a course. He sent his brother with a message to the Chamber of Deputies, asking them to concert measures for the national defence. In the evening Carnot went to the Peers and Lucien to the Deputies to appeal for a united national effort against the Powers, but their pleas were of no effect. On the 22nd of June, under the advice of his ministers, Napoleon took the final act of his official career, and abdicated in favor of his son. But the Deputies refused to recognize Napoleon II, and at once appointed an Executive Commission of 5 members, of which Fouché was chosen President. CHAPTER XXII.